This is Syed Zishan Hyder. I have come here to the University of Arizona to speak to world's most renowned philosopher. He is an expert in propaganda, media and war, author of Manufacturing Consent and many other world-famous books. He is undoubtedly the greatest intellectual of our time. Yes, I'm talking about Professor Noam Chomsky. I'm in the office of Mr. Noam Chomsky. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Noam Chomsky, for sitting down with me.
Pleased to be with you.
It is an absolute honor and a privilege to talk to you about the pressing matters of global significance.
Thank you.
So China has become a major economic power over the years. How you see China's One Belt, One Road initiative? In Pakistan, it's called CPEC, or China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. How is it going to impact the tug of war for the regional or perhaps global influence and hegemony?
Well, China has been following a careful and systematic policy for some years, well before this initiative was announced. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, based of course in China, has expanded to include Russia, the Central Asian states, most recently India and Pakistan. Iran as an observer, presumably going to move over as far as Turkey, given entry to Europe, and China is obviously the senior partner. The United States asked for observer status and was rejected. So it's going to be a China-based structure. The One Belt initiative is an expanded version of that. The Xi's effort to have China become a lead technological power is another aspect. Partly this is a reflection of the general geostrategic climate. I mean, all you have to do is look at a map to see that on the east, China is facing a string of hostile powers under the control of the United States, the world's most powerful state. So the ring from South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, down to the Philippines, which is kind of ambiguous, is basically there are U.S. military bases in Okinawa, Guam, and so on. So China is making efforts to try to gain control of its nearby territorial waters. The U.S. doesn't want to tolerate that, of course. And there are major conflicts in the South China Sea, also with the nearby countries. Vietnam has always been concerned about Chinese power, something that American strategists never understood. I can tell you an anecdote. When I visited Vietnam in 1970 at the height of the bombing of North Vietnam. There was a brief pause in the bombing. I was invited mainly to lecture at the Technological University, or more accurately, the ruins of the Technological University in Hanoi, Polytechnic. And I met with high officials and others, and they were completely clear about the fact that they were not really concerned about the Americans. They said the message essentially was, we understand that you're destroying our country, but you're going to leave. And China's not going to leave. They're there. That's our concern. They regaled me with stories of the 11th century resistance to China. It's interesting that American analysts could never understand this. But of course now it's surfacing what was always obvious. So yes, China has, the neighbors are concerned about Chinese expansionism and hegemony, but the real natural expansion of China is to the west. I don't know if you know the famous geostrategist Mackinder, who was highly influential in Western thinking, argued that control of Central Asia is really central to world power. The Eurasian region is basically the center of power in the world. North America happens to be now the most powerful state, but it's kind of an island off Eurasia. And China understands that. The Chinese have a couple of thousand years of thinking about hegemony and domination, and are pursuing a often ugly but rational policy of expanding Chinese power. We should recognize, however, that with all the talk and sometimes hysteria about China taking over the world, China's a poor country. If you take a look, say, at the UN Human Development Index, China ranks about 90th, I think.
In the West China part.
Yeah, and India, which is the other potential hegemon, is maybe 130th or something. And they have enormous internal problems that the West doesn't face, not only political, but ecological, demographic, and others. But they are certainly developing, and Western policy is helping them. So Trump, for example, who is, whatever you can argue about what he has in mind, but the effect is to weaken the United States and to isolate it and to evoke alliances to challenge the U.S., which is acting basically like a wrecking ball in international affairs. So still the most powerful thug on the block, so it can sort of intimidate people, but it's having effects. And the long-term effect is to strengthen China and weaken the United States. We'll have to see which direction Europe moves. Europe's poised. Is it going to accept U.S. Ugly domination, or is it going to try to join with the rest of the developing world as a counter to the United States, which could happen? It's not so obvious. What's happening in Iran today, August 7th, is a good example. But certainly, and Pakistan is of course drawn into this. China, as you know better than I do, has been financing the Gwadar port. It's one of the ways in which China is hoping to avoid the Western potential stranglehold of the Malacca Straits, which is basically the passage from the Middle East and South Asia to China. So this way they kind of get around it. The string of pearls policy in Sri Lanka and elsewhere is more strategic planning for that. And Pakistan is in the curious position of by now relying substantially on China for investment and loans, but also having a huge debt to China, incredible debt, never be able to pay it, especially if Pakistan continues on the utterly self-destructive policy of trying to match India in military force. That's suicidal for obvious reasons. As long as that goes on, Pakistan's never going to escape its problems. And we should bear in mind that it's not just today's strategic environment. All of South Asia, including Pakistan, is facing a horrendous crisis, namely global warming, which is already having an impact and is projected to have a horrifying impact not far in the future. Drought, already there's water shortages. In India, hundreds of millions of people barely have drinking water. The heat is becoming unbearable. The drought is extending as the Himalayan glaciers melt. It's possible that the water supplies will be dried up. You're going to have two nuclear-armed states struggling over diminished water resources, tens of millions of refugees. Bangladesh alone is probably going to generate tens of millions of refugees just from sea level rise. All of these things are converging on South Asia, which already has the worst poverty and inequality in the world. And it's the consequences of that are going to be horrifying. And to think that the countries are facing this and devoting their resources to means of destruction from a historic, you're looking at this from outer space, you think that the human species is insane. I mean, it's total insanity. They have to get over this, India and Pakistan, and start cooperating to deal with immense problems. All the problems that they talk about, like terrorism, but even worse ones, much worse ones, which could destroy the whole region.
Yeah.
You know.
Just again, you're going to the United States part. The United States has recently cut down much of its financial assistance to Pakistan, whereas China's influence is growing, and most recently somehow the Russians are also making inroads into Pakistan. The Russians, they are also trying to increase their influence in the region through Pakistan. So once you said that when United States lost its control over the Chinese in the past, they said they considered it as a loss of China.
It's a very interesting phrase.
My question is that has US lost Pakistan?
Well, just consider the phrase, which is a very interesting one from the point of view of propaganda and doctrine. Can I lose your computer? No, I can't. I can lose my computer. Yeah. I can't lose your computer. Yeah. Can the United States lose China? Only if it owns it. But the presupposition is the U.S. owns the world. Yes. So if some country moves to independence, we've lost it. And the loss of China, and the phrase, of course, is the one that's always used, in 1949, had an enormous effect on U.S. policy. It was internally, it's basically what led to the McCarthyist repression. Who was responsible for the loss of China? When John F. Kennedy was thinking of what should he do in Indochina, should he escalate? His idea was, I don't want to be blamed for the loss of Indochina. We now talk openly about the loss of Pakistan. All of that reflects deep-seated imperial ideology, so profound that it isn't even seen. It's like the air you breathe. We own the world, and if anybody tries to be independent, it's their aggression. Got to stop it. I can't allow loss of another area. That is freedom from our control. It goes back deep into European imperialism, but in North America and the West, it's overwhelming. So will the United States lose Pakistan? Well,
or has it already lost?
In other words, will Pakistan become independent of U.S. control? To an extent, probably not too much, but Pakistan is sort of poised between dependence on the U.S. and growing dependence on China, and forces internal to Pakistan will be critical in answering this question, but of course in the context of overwhelming external force. In my view, Pakistan will never have significant freedom of action as long as as the military is committed to military equality with India. That is an unbearable burden on any Pakistani government. There's no way to achieve it. It's kind of what happened in the 1960s with Russia and the United States. This is not too well known, but the facts are that when Khrushchev took power in Russia, he recognized that although Russia is a major industrial state, it cannot compete with the United States, which is a much huger economy with all kinds of advantages. Europe alone outweighed Russia in economic development by far, with the United States was overwhelming. So he wanted to carry out economic development in Russia, but understood that this could not be done if there was an arms race, because Russia can't possibly compete with the U.S. economically and militarily. So he therefore offered the United States a sharp mutual reduction in armaments, and in fact began to carry it out unilaterally in offensive military weapons. This was presented to the Kennedy administration. They considered it and rejected it. They reacted, in fact, by one of the biggest arms buildups in history, even though the United States was militarily far ahead. That's one of the factors that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Part of Khrushchev's reasons for sending missiles to Cuba was a reckless and crazy effort to sort of right the balance. The United States had far more extensive nuclear missile systems in Turkey, surrounding Russia with all kind of overwhelming power. And this was one of the reasons, was an effort to balance, to overcome the U.S. overwhelming capacity. The other reason, which is never discussed in the United States, is that the U.S. was poised to invade Cuba. There was a major terrorist operation going on, Operation Mongoose, under Kennedy, and in fact in August 1962 there was an official Kennedy document. The Russians may not have known it, but they could see basically what was happening on the ground, which called for an expansion of terrorism leading to a U.S. invasion in October 1962. That's when the missiles were installed. So these were the two main factors. But looking at the first one, the military imbalance, which bears on Pakistan, Khrushchev was, the Cuban Missile Crisis was ended with a complete humiliation of Khrushchev. He was soon thrown out. The military basically took over and did try to match the United States in military force. And to an extent they did. But of course that crushed the Russian economy. Just take a look at the relative power of the two. And finally Russia stagnated, also for internal reasons, but this was a major one, and ended up collapsing. Take a look at Pakistan. Smaller scale, but similar problem. Pakistan cannot compete militarily with far larger, more powerful India and still have a functioning economy. That's quite apart from geostrategic and other considerations.
But if the same strategy which the United States used against Russia to burn them out, actually, by increasing the...
It's not going to work in this case because there's China. Remember, this is much smaller scale than the Russia. It's similar in structure, but different in scale from the Russia-U.S. confrontation. And there was nobody around to bail out Russia.
Okay.
There is somebody around who's quite happy to make loans to Pakistan, to develop Pakistan, and to bring it into its orbit. That wasn't the case in the 1960s for Russia. So this strategy is not going to work for Russia, for Pakistan. What it will do, I don't think the United States now has a coherent strategy. It's just shots in the dark.
What about India? Like, there's a competition between India and Pakistan. What if India adopts the same strategy America adopted by burning out United States?
Well, to an extent it does. India is, of course, much more powerful. It's trying to establish, Russia and India and Pakistan are confronting each other in various ways in Afghanistan. India is trying to cut off possibilities for Pakistan to interact with the rest of the world. But it's devastating for India too. India also has extraordinary internal problems, devoting huge amounts to a military, which is incidentally largely confronting China, not Pakistan, makes no sense at all. In particular, because of what I said before, there are existential crises facing South Asia, questions of literal survival of the civilizations, simply from global warming. That should be the primary concern of India and Pakistan. How are we going to face this situation?
Right.
And it's being not only ignored, but exacerbated. There's a wonderful memoir by Arundhati Roy, who has an image of the line of the line of confrontation in Kashmir and high mountains, 12,000 feet up, where the glaciers are melting. Now, what they're revealing as they melt is the military equipment of India and Pakistan confronting each other in an insane war as the glaciers are melting and coming and saying we're going to destroy all of Southeast Asia. That's a kind of a evocative imagery of human insanity, but it's the reality that both India and Pakistan have to confront.